On a rain-soaked field in June 1815, two vast armies faced each other across muddy farmland in what would become one of the most decisive battles in European history. By sunset, the fate of an emperor and the future balance of power in Europe would be sealed on the fields near Waterloo. After returning from exile, Napoleon Bonaparte moved swiftly to rebuild his army, knowing that rival powers would not allow him to remain in control of France without challenge. A coalition quickly formed against him, including forces from United Kingdom, Prussia, and several allied states. Napoleon's plan was bold: defeat the allied armies separately before they could fully unite. Speed and precision had long been his strengths. In mid-June, his forces advanced into Belgium, clashing with Prussian troops at Ligny and driving them back. But the Prussian army did not collapse. Instead, it withdrew in relative order, intending to regroup and potentially rejoin the fight. Meanwhile, Anglo-Allied forces under the Duke of Wellington took position along a low ridge near Waterloo. Wellington carefully selected ground that offered defensive advantages, with farms and strongpoints anchoring his line. The night before the battle, heavy rain fell across the fields. By morning, the ground had turned thick and muddy. Artillery pieces sank into soft earth, cavalry horses struggled for firm footing, and infantry boots were coated in heavy clay. Napoleon delayed the start of the attack, hoping the ground would dry enough to allow his guns and cavalry to move effectively. But time was precious, and every hour increased the chance that Prussian forces would return to support Wellington. When the battle began late in the morning of June 18, French artillery opened fire in thunderous waves. Cannonballs tore through Allied lines, striking infantry squares and smashing into farm buildings that had been fortified overnight. Smoke drifted across the ridge as musket volleys cracked in reply. One of the first major objectives was the farmhouse of Hougoumont, positioned on the Allied right. French troops launched repeated assaults against its walls and gates. Fighting there became savage in close quarters, with defenders holding doorways and courtyards against overwhelming pressure. Flames engulfed parts of the structure, yet the defenders refused to yield. Hougoumont became a battle within a battle, absorbing thousands of troops that might otherwise have been used elsewhere. Further along the line, French infantry advanced in columns toward the ridge. From below, they marched uphill under fire, drums beating, flags raised. As they approached the crest, Wellington's troops, who had been lying down behind the ridge to avoid artillery, suddenly rose and unleashed devastating volleys at close range. The shock was immense. Columns faltered under concentrated musket fire, yet the French pressed forward repeatedly, each assault testing the defenders' resolve. Cavalry charges added another dramatic dimension. Waves of French horsemen swept across the muddy fields, sabers flashing, aiming to break Allied formations. But infantry formed squares, tight defensive formations bristling with bayonets, presenting walls of steel that horses hesitated to penetrate. Cannon crews scrambled to shelter within squares as cavalry thundered past. The ground shook under hooves, and the clash of metal rang out over the field. Despite setbacks, Napoleon continued to commit reserves, determined to break Wellington before Prussian reinforcements arrived. Meanwhile, on the distant flank, signs of Prussian approach began to appear. Dust clouds and distant gunfire signaled their advance. Wellington's troops held on under immense strain, knowing that survival depended on time. By late afternoon, Prussian forces began engaging French units on the right flank near the village of Planchenoit. This forced Napoleon to divert troops to contain the threat, weakening his main assault. The battlefield now expanded, with fighting raging across multiple sectors. Coordination grew increasingly difficult. Orders were delayed, misinterpreted, or overtaken by events. In one final effort, Napoleon committed his imperial guard, elite veteran troops who had rarely been defeated. Their advance toward the Allied center was steady and disciplined, a last attempt to shatter Wellington's line. Allied soldiers watched anxiously as the Guard climbed the ridge. When they reached musket range, volleys erupted once more. Fierce exchanges followed. To the shock of many, the Guard began to waver and then retreat. The psychological impact was enormous. The sight of the Imperial Guard withdrawing signaled that the battle had turned decisively. Allied troops surged forward. French formations, already strained by hours of combat and mounting pressure from Prussian forces, began to lose cohesion. What had been an organized struggle transformed into retreat. As evening approached, the battlefield was a chaotic scene of smoke, shattered formations, abandoned cannons, and exhausted soldiers. Prussian troops pressed the pursuit, preventing any chance of orderly withdrawal. Napoleon's army, once a symbol of near invincibility, dissolved into fragments fleeing southward. The cost of the battle was staggering. Tens of thousands were killed or wounded in a single day. Fields were littered with muskets, torn uniforms, broken wheels, and fallen horses. Nearby villages were filled with wounded men awaiting treatment. Surgeons worked without pause, and civilians struggled to comprehend the scale of destruction that had engulfed their countryside. Strategically, Waterloo ended Napoleon's rule permanently. Within days, he would abdicate again and later be exiled far from Europe. The balance of power shifted decisively. The coalition powers emerged dominant, and a new political order began to take shape across the continent. For military historians, Waterloo illustrates the importance of terrain, timing, coalition coordination, and resilience under pressure. Wellington's defensive positioning, the steadfast defense of key strongpoints, and the timely arrival of Prussian reinforcements combined to counter Napoleon's offensive skill. It also demonstrates how weather and ground conditions can influence artillery and cavalry effectiveness in crucial ways. For modern audiences, the battle carries dramatic weight because it represents a climactic showdown. It was not merely another engagement, but a decisive confrontation between competing visions of Europe's future. The image of disciplined lines exchanging volleys across muddy fields, of cavalry charges breaking against infantry squares, and of elite guards making a final stand has become embedded in historical memory. Today, the fields near Waterloo are peaceful, marked by memorials and monuments. It is difficult to imagine the thunder of cannon and the chaos of that June day. Yet the events of June 18, 1815 continue to echo through history books and popular imagination. Waterloo remains a symbol of decisive defeat, of ambition meeting determined resistance, and of a single day reshaping an era. In the end, the Battle of Waterloo was more than a military encounter. It was the final act of a long period of revolutionary wars that had transformed Europe. On that rain-soaked battlefield, amid smoke and mud, the destiny of an empire was decided, proving once again that in war, preparation, alliances, and endurance can overturn even the boldest ambitions.